The U.S. now calls for extreme vetting of immigrants. The world's refugee population continues to swell. But here's another side to immigration. A U.S. high school student of African parents was recently accepted into all 8 Ivy League universities, a feat accomplished by only a handful of people, almost all African diaspora. Hello, I'm Carol Pineau. Welcome to our special series, Africa and the Trump Administration. We see heart-wrenching images, refugee camps teeming with people and tents as far as the eye can see, rickety boats filled to the brim with people desperate for a better life, or even worse, a capsized boat and bodies of those who didn't make it. And then there are images of a different sort, of Americans shouting, "Build that wall," of immigration and customs enforcement or ICE agents rounding up immigrants, and of deportations that tear families apart. And yet another image of doctors, researchers, professors, entrepreneurs throughout the U.S., only they are African diaspora, the most educated immigrant group in America. The U.S. is a country built by immigrants. So how did it go from saying, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses," to build that wall and debating immigration bans on Muslim-majority countries? We have a great panel with us today. We have Eskinder Nagesh, Senior VP at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants and former Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement during the Obama administration. Rose Essiam, Administrative Lead at the Young African Professionals Network, and Henry Olson, author and Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks, Carol, for having us.
Yes. So let's start with how we got to where we are today of this great immigration debate. And maybe, Eskinder, you can start with us on where things are with immigration and refugees throughout the world.
Well, again, immigration and refugees, two different immigration definition. Refugees have been coming to this country, at least African refugees, since 1980. What we are now is the issue of a humanitarian response to a refugee crisis is being discussed through a national security lens. So we had never had really, because refugee program is based on the U.S. national security, humanitarian response, and at the same time part of the foreign policy. That's really the foundation of how refugees are coming to this country. So we had that good history of accepting refugees, including Muslim refugees from Somalia. I think we probably resettled more Muslim Somali refugees than any other country. And during the Bosnia crisis, we again, the U.S. was a leading agency in terms of accepting Bosnian refugees. Unfortunately, given the national discussion in this country between terrorism and national security, the refugees are becoming mixed with the other issues. And we resist the idea that we can't see migration and refugee programs through a national security perspective, rather a humanitarian response. So that's where we are.
What we found in the survey that was done was that if you were an Obama voter in 2012, and you felt that immigration was a net negative and that immigrants should be either restricted in number or deported, then you were much more likely to vote for President Trump than if you didn't have that. That and beliefs about whether Muslims should be resettled in the United States were the two single largest drivers in moving people from Obama over to Trump.
But why do you think that this happened, that people became more impassioned by it?
Well, a couple of things. Economic stagnation produces increasing frustration about people who are not native born.
When you see on television, on the news, and people talk about this is what immigrants are like, is that the image that you have of African immigrants?
It would depend on who is sharing that narrative, right? Because sometimes it's accurate and sometimes it's not. There are significantly more African diasporans who are ambitious and really hardworking and contributing to the economic growth of both the U.S. and African countries that I don't think we hear enough about. So what we constantly hear about Africa, as time and time again, is about the disease, the poverty, and what the young African diasporans are really representing is more modern, progressive, creative, often entrepreneurial, right? Finding ways of addressing some of the most pressing global issues here in the U.S. and at home, and they're contributing significantly in ways that we should be focusing more attention on.
Let me add something. I think part of the challenge we have is who is actually writing the narrative. If I'm not mistaken, all of us are immigrants here. Yeah, it's a question of who came first. You have also in this country a perception that's created, I think, in the 60s and 70s, Africans, in Tarzan movies and everything else. That perception is really hard to erase quickly. But if you go to every law firm or healthcare provider, you see Nigerians, doctors, Indian doctors, and Vietnamese lawyers. So that's really that's where really we're missing is who is actually sharing that narrative. And once you start playing with people's fear, it's really hard to have a decent discussion in terms.
President Trump has called for drastically reducing the number of immigrants allowed into the U.S. Meanwhile, Europe has taken in vast numbers of refugees, far more than America. But it has caused political turmoil, even contributed to Brexit. But then there's Uganda, the small East African nation that took in more refugees last year than all of Europe. Uganda, unlike other countries where refugees are often secluded in camps, offers its immigrants the right to work, own land, and travel freely. The result? Less than 1% of all refugees in Uganda live on public assistance. Instead, they are productive members of society that add to the Ugandan economy. So, Henry, the Ugandan example is actually very much what Iskander was just talking about. Mm-hmm. Why is it that in America we're not seeing this?
Well, I think what you've got in America is a concern about terrorism, that you have a concern that is particularly geared towards Islamic refugees, and in the last campaign, particularly at refugees from Syria, a war-torn country. And they say, is it worth the risk? And I think that's not a concern for whatever reason that the Ugandan either government or people have, that if they bring people in, that there is a mentality of the people who come in, that even if it's 1 in 10,000, that one person could kill 50, 100, 150 native-born people. And we know from social science that people exaggerate unknown risks, that it's...
Right, we don't worry about not wearing seatbelts, but we worry about the random terrorists coming in.
That's right. And the terrorism risk is something that is both unknown and something that you cannot have some sense of individual agency over. So people naturally exaggerate that. It doesn't mean it's not real, but they exaggerate. It's part of our human nature.
If you remember, in Uganda, in fact, Al-Shabaab killed many people in the restaurant in Kampala. But again, the government of Uganda said that they are not going to be defined by Al-Shabaab in terms of what their humanitarian response will be. I think one thing we are missing is 86% of all refugees in the world are actually hosted by poor countries.
Yes.
86%.
86? I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. And this is, and we bring a very small number of refugees. And the way we do it is quite different than Europeans. It takes about 18 months of the security clearance process. The average stay of refugee in a refugee camp is 17 years. If you go to Sudan...
17 years?
17 years. If you go to...
Does that include the Palestinian refugee camps?
No. If you go, for example, I'll give you one example. In eastern Sudan, you have Eritrean refugees in 1967. 50 years. Somehow, we came up with this containment policy. As long as they're living in refugee camp, we are fine. But if they decided to get out of the camp and search for a better life, then it becomes a crisis. That's really what we have. So if you look at it in terms of who is going to Europe, these are the people going without going through the vetting process to Europe. Our process is you have to wait, you have to be selected by UNHCR, you have to go through a security clearance, we have to go for medical clearance, and then you wait, and you wait.
You know, Rose, you sort of come at this from both sides. You now live here. You did immigrate from Ghana, I believe. How do you see this whole debate? This change and America saying no to refugees, and yet a country that you came to that was supposed to be a place to come and make your future.
Yeah, and so as you said, I sort of see this from both sides, and this is my adopted home, this is my home, and yet I still have such a strong connection to Ghana. And going back to the comment about agency that was made earlier, one thing that I appreciate about the opportunities that I've gained here in the U.S. is the opportunity to increase that sense of agency and then to hopefully contribute to changing the narrative, as we've talked time and time about. And so for me, while I think it's very disheartening to hear folks on one end saying, travel ban, and sort of criticizing immigrants in a way that I know is not true based on who I am and based on who I know my family and my friends and who our YAP DC members are. I also, it's disheartening in that way, but I also know that we are working towards creating a better sense of understanding of who we are in the diaspora and who people are back at home in Africa and contributing and being productive as we see in Uganda and other places. And so that's our work. That's my commitment in this fight is not taking too much, not being too frustrated about the voices that are speaking against immigration, but galvanizing support, galvanizing other diasporans and truly working towards changing our narrative through the media, through literature, through entrepreneurial efforts, through policy. That's sort of how we are approaching this.
More than 2 million African immigrants live in the U.S. today, about 5% of the total immigrant population. Africans are the fastest growing immigrant group, and their achievements are well documented. But the picture is not all rosy. African immigrants often face American racism against color and, more recently, against Muslims. Deportations are up astronomically, as are hate crimes against immigrants. As the president of the African Union said of the U.S. immigration ban, we are in for turbulent times. So, Henry, how do you see these turbulent times?
I think people need to try and address some of the legitimate concerns that a number of Americans have. But to the person who can't find a job and finds that the person who's going to be hired may or may not be here legally, or they start going to a grocery store and they see that the people behind the counters can't speak the language very well, and you wonder what about their documented immigration status. That's the sort of thing that you have to address that, and you have to address that in some way that respects that perceived reality rather than trying to substitute our perceived reality to say, no, what we experience in our neighborhoods is the only perception that counts. And once you engage them, there's many surveys that say that people don't favor deportation. They're concerned about security, but they're also generous to genuine refugees, but they don't feel that their fears or concerns are being heard because terrorists don't attack in our neighborhoods. We're not threatened, our jobs, by competition from people coming overseas. It's complementary, it's not replacement. And we tend to turn to these people and say, no, our perception is the only perception you need to get with the program. And that produces resentment, and it produces reaction in an extreme way. That when people feel silenced, that they have no voice, they tend to yell louder. And that's what we've been seeing politically throughout the world, is people who feel they have no voice are yelling really loudly. And we can either continue to tell them they should have no voice, in which case they will yell louder, or we can say, okay, now we've heard you, let's incorporate you into a conversation that incorporates all of our perspectives, not simply yours, but ours, but doesn't do it in a patronizing way.
Skinner, how could we incorporate their concerns into what needs to be done for refugees and immigrants?
The whole refugee settlement in the U.S. is not 100% subsidized by government. It's a community-based refugee resettlement system we have. The churches, the synagogue, the mosque, everybody is part of the process. So we have this community support in places where refugees are being resettled, but we have to do a better job in having a discussion, introducing the refugees to their community. Perhaps that's something that we haven't done a lot, but we continue to do that.
I would love to have these nonprofit agencies in some way have a public vetting role or a vouching role. If we have concerns about Islamic terrorism, have Islamic groups vouch for the people who they're trying to bring in and resettle. Again, as a way of reassuring the people that it's not just a government who they don't necessarily trust who's saying, trust us, but rather having people that they know on the ground say, look, we've been through this. We know you can look me in the face, a person in your community, and I'll tell you this person is safe.
Well, you see, my issue is we have a vouching system. Not a single refugee will come to this country without going at least 18 to 24 months of security vetting process, including, on top of that, health screening also. So I think, I can't imagine that a Catholic charity in my diocese will be the one watching for the refugees they haven't met.
And what many Americans see is that in this country and in other countries, once, 2, 3, 4 times a year, there is violence of a terroristic nature that is committed by somebody from the outside of the community, often but not always a refugee, and almost always in the modern era from a Muslim background. And yes, the risks are exaggerated, but that's a reality. And a government that says we're solving the terrorism problem and the attacks continue to happen is one that doesn't have the credibility to stand up and say, trust our vetting system, to which people will say, well, we trusted you to say that you're going to stop the terrorist attacks, and yet another one happened.
You know, Rose, this issue of the other, this really gets into that continuum of assimilation versus multiculturalism. And it seems to me that African diaspora immigrants are somewhat different. Most of them come speaking English. There does seem to be much more of an assimilation. My understanding, I've read some statistics that African immigrants tend to assimilate better than many other immigrant groups. What's your experience with that?
Yes, so I actually would, rather than using the term assimilation, I prefer to use the word integration, right?
It's a little bit loaded in America.
Right.
But I get what you mean.
Certainly, yeah. And one thing that I'm hopeful for in hearing my colleagues here is that the African diaspora, Africans are uniquely collective, right? They come from collectivist communities. We are very concerned for the other. And so I'm hopeful that as we join and we integrate into these communities, that we will find unique and innovative ways of reaching out to those who may have these concerns, finding ways of community building. I think that there is the possibility of being able to sort of provide that personal touch, right, to the individual who may have lost their job at the factory and now feels like, the person that the cashier has taken their job, right? Perhaps there's a refugee who can communicate to them that that's not quite the case. So I'm hopeful that the collectivist nature of Africans can contribute positively to the community building in this matter.
Rose, there is the other side of this. The kinds of things that I'm hearing about of Africans coming through the airport with their U.S. passport and still being questioned far more than others who are not African. How are you seeing that among your friends? Are you hearing a lot of stories of that?
Yes, we will. What I can say is that with the new administration, there has been an increase of reports of hate crimes and of moments when folks have felt discriminated against or targeted in a way that would have otherwise perhaps not happened in a few years ago. And it's disheartening, it's frustrating for the individuals and for their communities to, on one hand, we talk about the well-educated and ambitious and working hard, and then to be seen seen as an incompetent and almost, as a criminal within your community that you've worked so hard to contribute towards. It's quite unfortunate, it's quite disheartening, but it is happening to professionals, young professionals in the diaspora all over. In the workplace, I would say, we also hear of discrimination that has increased, right? Considering someone is incompetent or incoherent because of a slight language barrier is quite unfortunate, but we're seeing this time and time again. And we're hopeful and hopeful that in partnering with some of our partners, such as the mayor's office, that we can continue on in a positive direction.
Let's take some questions from our viewers. Seth in New York asks, Americans are tolerant of African Muslims in the U.S., so why are they banning them from Africa? Is there a difference between those here and the ones there? Are they not all the same people? Skidder, this is a very good point, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. The Somalis in Somalia, or the Somalis in Ethiopia, or the Somalis in Kenya, or any other place are the same.
Or Minnesota.
Or Minnesota. We have over 100,000 Somalis who live in Minnesota. And I can assure you that they didn't go to Minnesota because they like the weather. Because Minnesota is a good place to raise a family, the kids to go to school. You will find a lot of Somali kids are going to Ivy League schools, working hard, and there are about 15 shopping centers in Minneapolis. So, they're the same people. I think the question is, who come to this country? And the answer is, refugees who come to this country have a well-founded fear of persecution at their country, and therefore they're given a chance to come to this country like any other refugees coming, whether from Asia or other countries.
And last, from Alice in Kenya. The African Union is discussing open borders, while the U.S. and Europe talk of shutting immigrants out. Does Africa's more progressive view on immigration show a disconnect between Africa and the U.S.? So, Henry, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that what you have in both countries, or both sets of countries, America and the U.S. and Europe, is a group of people who have not been doing well and are feeling cultural change, feeling economic pressure. And you take a look at what Chancellor Merkel did, inviting 2 million refugees in. Well, that would be akin to America, as a percentage of population, inviting 8 million people in 1 year. If we had 8 million people from the Middle East come to the United States in 1 calendar year, that would create issues. And so that's the sort of questions that people are talking about, is how do we digest the change that has already occurred in a way so that we can accommodate everyone, not just the people who want to be here, but the people who are already here, not all of whom are seeing their life prospects improve on a yearly basis.
Can I add something to that? Who wants to leave their own country, to go to another place? The only reason these refugees are decided to leave and to leave their country, everything behind, is because of the political situation in their own country. So Africa has a lot to answer for this issue. We have more refugees now living in outside because of the political situation in Africa. In 1955, we didn't have a single African refugees in Africa. Nothing. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, the only refugee camp we had in the 40s in Africa, mostly in Egypt and Tunisia, was European refugees. So unless we solve this issue of these repressive governments in Africa, whether you come up with an open border policy or not, it doesn't really solve the problem.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much to my guests, Eskinder Nagesh, Rose Assim, and Henry Olson. To our viewers in Africa, America, and around the world, thank you so much for joining us.